Today's story isn't some fanciful folktale passed down through the generations or an ancient, forgotten legend. This is a story excavated from the silent annals of history. A cold case buried deep within decades of church ledgers, forgotten missing persons reports, and the scorched remains of long-gone homesteads. It's a tale of the spectral lineage of children. Some say they were twins. Others claim they were mere copies, raised by a woman who vanished from the world after a public scandal in the year 1921. The people of that quiet county whispered about them, giving them the chilling name, the Mirror Children. Imagine unearthing a faded, curling photograph, an object that shouldn't exist, showing two boys with bare feet standing in front of a dilapidated cabin that is no longer on any map. And as you study their faces, you realize with a jolt that they're identical, yet profoundly different. One is a perfect reflection of the other, but an error in the copy has left a subtle, unsettling imperfection. Their eyes don't quite align. A jawline is slightly askew. They are the same, yet not, like a mirror image that has somehow gone wrong. What would you do? Would you keep such a photograph? A key to a forgotten mystery? Or would you be so disturbed by its implications that you burn it and try to forget you ever saw it? Welcome to Gothic Ledger. Before we delve into the shadows, do something for me right now. Take a moment to glance at the clock where you are. Jot down the time you're watching this, and tell us where you are in the world. Because no matter how far you are from the verdant, tangled hills of Kentucky, this particular story has an eerie way of finding its way back to you, of completing its circle. These children were never registered for school. They were never baptized into any church. There are no birth records, no graves, no census data to confirm their existence. Yet, they continue to be seen, always in perfect pairs, always in perfect synchronization. And in 2019, a government surveillance drone captured a fleeting video of them, a piece of irrefutable modern evidence that sent shivers down the spines of the few officials who saw it. Let me tell you what the state of Kentucky tried to bury in its archives, and what the unyielding land itself refused to keep quiet. This is an exploration of the terrifying possibilities of genetics, the consequences of extreme isolation, and the chilling story of a woman who may have deliberately engineered her own bloodline. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe to stay with us. If you've been here before, you already know the rules. Keep the lights low, listen closely, and if you see something move in the corner of your screen, do not, under any circumstances, look away. The story of the Mirror Children begins not with a birth, but with a photograph no one remembers taking. In the early spring of 1939, a catastrophic flood swept through southeastern Kentucky, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. In the aftermath, a team of local archivists was dispatched to salvage what they could from the waterlogged and submerged rooms beneath the Leslie County Courthouse. Most of what they discovered was exactly what you expect to find: mold-warped tax records, birth registries with ink so blurred they were unreadable and fragile, waterlogged ledgers that crumbled to the touch. But in the bottom of an unmarked drawer, tucked away inside a warped metal filing cabinet, they found something completely unexpected. It was a photograph, faded and curled at the edges, carefully hidden between two blank folio sheets, as if someone had intentionally concealed it rather than merely storing away. The image itself was stark and simple. Two boys, both barefoot, stood side by side in front of a collapsing cabin. Their shirts hung awkwardly on their slight shoulders, looking like hand-me-downs from another era. One boy's mouth was slightly agape, a vacant expression on his face. The other boy's eyes seemed to lack any focal point, staring into an empty distance. Their faces were an unsettling mix of identical and wrong. They were nearly a match, but not quite. One eye was set slightly lower than the other. A jaw was just perceptibly misaligned. It was a mirror reflection that had somehow failed to settle cleanly, a copy that had been imperfectly rendered. There was no studio stamp, no photographer's mark, and no writing on the back to provide any clue to its origin. No negatives of the photo were ever found. And yet, to those who worked in the archives, the image felt deliberate, as if it were meant to be discovered at a later date, or perhaps never at all. According to the 1939 flood damage cleanup log, the image was cataloged without incident, filed with a generic label, unknown children, possible homestead case. The archivist who entered it, a woman named Martha Sullivan, later claimed she didn't remember the act of cataloging it. In a 1973 oral history interview, she recounted, "It gave me a feeling like I was interrupting something. I just put it in a box and moved on, but it didn't stay box." In 1951, the photograph inexplicably resurfaced in a local historical society's unsorted drawer. It appeared again in 1986, this time referenced in a brief report on unmarked homesteads in the Appalachian interior. By then, the story had begun to acquire folkloric quality among local whisperers, who had given the boys a chilling new name, the Mirror Children. Most trace the term back to a retired mail carrier named Edward Tullis, who, in a recorded interview from 1969, said they weren't twins, not really, but they matched like someone tried to make a copy from the other, and the ink ran out halfway. You'd see them if you rode the mail up near Hollow Ridge back then, just standing quiet at the tree line, watching. When the photograph was shown to elderly locals during a regional folklore project in the 1990s, a few recognized the background, not the boys, but the cabin. They remembered the specific details. The sloping roof, the warped porch beam, the distinct absence of the third step. That particular homestead, they said, had once belonged to a woman named Lila Mae Merriweather, known to the community only as Miss Lila. She lived alone, if you could call it that, on the edge of Hollow Ridge outside of Hyden, Kentucky. She hadn't been seen in town since the early 1920s. No census records ever listed children in her household. No school in the county had ever enrolled boys matching the ones in the photo, and no obituary, baptism, or hospital record named Lila as a mother. And yet, the rumors persisted. A now-lost WPA field notebook from 1940 contained a single haunting line, scrawled in pencil that read, "Miss Lila's cabin was inhabited by two pale boys who may not be her kin. To this day, no one knows who took the photograph. No one remembers giving it to the court, nor why it ended up misfiled beneath a stack of pre-war property deeds. But archivists and researchers who have studied the image agree there is something profoundly wrong about it. The faces, the identical but unsettling posture, the way neither boy seems to be fully aware of the camera's presence or even of each other. And the image itself still exists. It is cataloged in Box 14, File 6 of the Leslie County Archives, stamped with an official mark but never explained. Its only date is that of the water damage it sustained in the flood of '39. It is the first known trace of the story that would become a haunting folklore. And someone, perhaps Lila herself, wanted it to be seen, just not yet, in the hushed, winding interior of Leslie County, where roads curl into the very roots of forgotten hills. There's a ridge that locals still call Hollow Ridge, even though no official map bears a name. The land there is a tangled mess of thick undergrowth, perpetually damp and heavy with the scent of laurel and the clinging presence of fog. Hunters refuse to bring their dogs into its confines, claiming their hounds won't follow a scent there. The trees, they say, feel too still, too quiet. At the center of that unnatural stillness once stood a cabin, now slumping into the very soil from which it was built. But in 1938, it was still whole enough to serve as a home. It was here, records suggest, that Lila Mae Merriweather lived, and where the first unspoken chapter of the Mirror Children began. Lila was born in 1889, the third of 6 children in the Merriweather family, a lineage that had long occupied the Hyden area, their lives marked only by the marginalia of land deeds and census logs. The last official record placing her in public life is a 1906 property transaction, when she inherited the cabin after her mother's death at the age of 17. The property itself was modest, a one-room structure, perpetually thirsty for water from a nearby spring that, frustratingly, dried up every third summer. There were no known upgrades, no plumbing, and no official improvements ever filed with the county. Yet the taxes were always paid, consistently in exact change, and always in person, until 1921. That year, everything abruptly stopped. Lila Mae Merriweather withdrew from town life with suddenness that fueled whispers and rumors. The reason for her public seclusion, suppressed by time and community silence, is hinted at in a 1923 church ledger from First Baptist Church of Hyden. A single line beneath her name reads, "Stricken from the rolls on grounds of moral unfitness." There is no further elaboration, no footnote, But locals who were old enough to remember recalled the scandal. A former church secretary interviewed in 1978 recalled overhearing an elders meeting behind closed doors. She remembered a pastor saying that Lila had brought unholy confusion into her household and that her youngest brother, Samuel, had vanished shortly after a long illness. No missing person report was ever filed. From that year on, Lila never again appeared in church records, voter logs, or town ledgers. She did not marry. She did not attend funerals. She simply ceased to be seen until 1938. That's when reports began to circulate. Quietly at first, then with a growing nervous urgency. Figures were being spotted near Hollow Ridge. 2 boys, pale and lean, were seen gathering kindling near the tree-line. They were always together, always silent. No one knew their names. No one recalled a birth. They didn't attend a county school, weren't listed in the 1940 census, and the nearest midwife denied ever delivering twins that fit their description. And yet there they were, visible to a handful of curious hunters and a single rural postman who described them as identical, but not. It was like seeing the same face on 2 clocks. He said, one ran fast, one ran slow, but they ticked the same. The boys were always near the cabin, never venturing further than 100 yards. They never answered when called out to, and Lila, older now, her hair long and gray, was said to appear on the porch once every 2 weeks when the mail wagon came up the ridge. She'd stand motionless until the driver dropped off the parcel, offering no wave, no words, just a silent, unnerving presence. The few who dared climb past the old fence line said the land itself felt strange, like something was watching, even in the bright light of day. One farmer recalled his horse refusing to step within 30 feet of the front gate. It was like the ground itself was holding its breath, he told a folklorist in 1964. No birth certificates were ever filed. No names were given. No records of adoption existed. And still, from 1938 until at least 1954, Lila lived with them. 2 boys who bore no traceable origin, growing older but never outward. They had no friends, no visitors, and no one dared ask questions. The central question remains, were they hers? Were they family? Or were they something else entirely? Whatever they were hers. And whatever happened in that cabin over those 16 years, it happened outside the view of any authority. Lila made Merriweather didn't just leave public life. She erased it, and in its place, something else took root. The Appalachian back roads in 1949 were less like actual roads and more like fleeting memories, with gravel paths folding into deep forest and the sun swallowed by thick overgrowth. For a traveling merchant like Howard Kittner, who hauled crates of nails, lanterns, and kerosene stoves across 3 counties, the way into a hollow was half forgotten, and the way out was never certain. On June 17th of that year, his usual route took him along the upper ridgeline west of Hyden, near a hollow rarely marked on any map. Locals called it Dead Mare Cut, a place so remote and foreboding it was avoided even by seasoned moonshiners. Kittner hadn't planned to stop. He just intended to pass through and reach a homestead rumored to be in need of stovepipe. But the path narrowed abruptly, and his mule team stalled at a sharp bend near an old cedar post fence. That's when he saw them. 2 boys stood on the porch of a collapsing cabin, framed by leaning beams and weather-gray wood. They were barefoot, their shirts made of fabric far too large for their slight frames. Their arms hung at their sides, their stillness unnerving. There was no fidgeting, no greeting, just a profound, silent immobility. They didn't look at me exactly, Kittner later wrote in a letter. One was staring somewhere behind me, and the other, well, I don't think he was seeing at all. He continued his detailed observations. Their faces were alike, but wrong, like someone tried to match 2 halves of coin after mold had melted. Their eyes, he said, were cloudy, not in the way of blindness, but in a strange, unsettling way, like river water behind a thick fog. There was no sound from the cabin, no movement. Kittner, disturbed, tipped his hat, mumbled a polite howdy, and clicked the reins. Neither child even blinked in response. That evening, still disturbed and unsure what he had witnessed, Kittner did something rare for a man of his profession. He sat at a small desk in a hiding boarding house where he was staying and wrote a letter to the Kentucky State Welfare Office in Frankfort. The letter, dated June 18, 1949, was a heartfelt plea. It read, "To whom it may concern, I am a traveling merchant of tools and household goods operating primarily in Leslie and Perry counties. Yesterday, while passing to the upper ridge above Hyden, I came upon a cabin I had not seen before. On the porch stood two young boys. They appeared to be undernourished, but not starved, barefoot, and completely unspeaking. They did not react when I spoke. I saw no sign of a guardian or parent. I am writing not because of injury or neglect in the physical sense, but because no child should look that empty. Their expressions were blank. Their movements were absent. They weren't dirty. They weren't bruised, just hollow. That's worse. I do not know if this warrants your attention, but something about them was wrong in a way I cannot explain. I believe they are in need of help of some kind. Respectfully, Howard J. Kittner." The letter was logged in a clerical ledger dated June 22nd, a log that still exists, unearthed during a university archival project in the 1990s. The entry, labeled Rural Report, Hyden Vicinity, Unknown Minors, was never assigned a case number. That year, Kentucky's welfare system received over 4,000 handwritten letters from rural counties, many of them without return addresses, according to a former intake clerk interviewed decades later. Anything from Hyden went straight to the bottom of the pile. It was too far gone, too few roads to warrant a visit. Kittner's letter joined a massive stack of unfiled reports in a box marked non-urgent remote claims. The box was never reviewed. Dr. Melissa Burr, a regional historian and author of the book Hollows Without Maps, later said of the letter, "That was the moment the state had a chance. A man with no reason to lie saw something that didn't sit right. He wrote it down and they shelved it. No follow-up was ever conducted. No one from Frankfort ever visited dead Mare Cut. The boys were never identified. The cabin remained untouched, and so the letter, a fragile warning, faded, filed away in the dark, just like the children it described. A warning that was not lost, but simply unread. Whatever Kittner saw on that porch didn't go away. It grew quietly unseen until someone else came looking. The interior of the Merriweather cabin no longer stands, but fragments of its rigid order and bizarre rules have been meticulously reconstructed from old field notes, forensic inventories, and a handful of recovered artifacts. The haunting picture that emerges is not a home, but a ritualistic space, a kind of psychological prison fixed in place by a suffocating atmosphere of silence, symmetry, and fear. By the early 1940s, the structure had already begun to physically collapse under the weight of its own age, with a sagging porch and shingles rotted through. The windows, though miraculously intact, had long since been covered from the inside. Heavy, dark burlap was nailed across each pane, not to keep out the weather, but to prevent reflection. According to one oral account collected in the 1970s, the coverings were so thick you couldn't tell day from night inside the cabin. Inside, the cabin followed a series of chilling rules. There were no mirrors, not even polished metal surfaces. Every surface that could hold a reflection, glass, old oil pans, even water basins, was covered, hidden, or removed entirely. An investigator who visited the site decades later noted that even the door of the old wood stove had been painted a matte black to prevent a reflective gleam. The windows were double covered in a warped vanity, likely an inherited family piece, had its mirror turned to face the wall, fixed in place with rusted nails and what appeared to be dried animal sinew. Meals were eaten in absolute silence. There were 3 settings at a small table, but no utensils. Food was passed from one chipped tin plate to another. The center of the table bore a scorched ring where something once rested, possibly a lantern or an iron crucible used for some strange purpose. A note scribbled by social worker Evelyn Cross, recovered posthumously, reads, "The boys wait for her to chew before they begin. They copy her hands. Every bite matched, like clock hands clicking in unison." The note also confirms that the children were not called by names. Miss Lila referred to them only as my echoes. The unsettling term appears again and again in her few personal effects. Scraps of cloth inked with looping cursive, fragment of old hymnals altered to include plural pronouns. We rise, we fall, we echo. Local linguists later identified traces of an Appalachian-inflected Gaelic dialect in these fragments, a language rarely spoken beyond the 19th century and preserved only in isolated mountain pockets. The words Shana Anam, same soul, were found carved into a wooden beam above where the boys slept, one of the few pieces of direct testimony for within the cabin. One of the few surviving pieces of direct testimony comes not from Lila, but from one of the boys himself, or at least what is believed to be his hand. Under the frame of a rusted iron bed, thin, uneven gouges carved by a nail or a knife were found. The inscription read, "My brother cries with no sound. We share the same night. I was born too late. We eat from her hand. We speak when the wind stops." The handwriting is crude. The letters double back over themselves as if the boy were unsure of their shape or meaning. The phrase, "we share the same night," appears 3 times, always spaced apart. Those who studied the markings remarked not only on the content, but the coordination. One forensic specialist noted it was as if the writing was done with one hand but 2 minds. Portraits lined the walls, but their faces were all turned away. Old Merriweather family photos were found in a cedar chest during a 1960s excavation. Most were scratched through at the eyes, a deliberate act of defacement. A few had been folded carefully down the center, obscuring the faces, while others were smeared with a waxy, black substance believed to be a mixture of soot and lard. They had not been burned, only obscured. Tools, too, were strangely altered. A hammerhead had been repurposed into a chime. A pitchfork was bent into an arch and placed above the doorframe like a crude sigil. Even religious items were present, but changed. A rosary had double crosses. A Bible had sections of scripture removed and replaced with handwritten phrases in a mixture of Gaelic and English. On the final page of the Psalms, the words, "They are one, born in rhythm. Let no mirror speak." In the spring of 1953, Evelyn Cross, a 24-year-old social worker from Louisville, was assigned to a newly funded outreach program. The initiative, part of a post-war public health grant, was tasked with locating and evaluating families living in extreme isolation throughout Appalachia. Its aim was to bring basic welfare access, food stamps, and schooling to forgotten hollers in counties no longer accessible by rail or regular post. Evelyn was bright, ambitious, and newly graduated from Berea College with honors in sociology and Appalachian studies. Her peers described her as idealistic, perhaps to a fault. Her supervisor, in a memo dated March 9th, wrote, "Miss Cross is determined to reach those no one else will, that can be useful or dangerous." Her assignment brought her to Hyden, Kentucky, a town already known for its economic decline and dwindling population due to mine closures and washed-out roads. Her driver, a local hired for navigation, refused to go past the timberline near Hollow Ridge. The roads, he said, don't like strangers. Lunch, and a copy of the state-issued welfare assessment form. At the top of the ridge stood the Merriweather cabin, though she had no name for it yet. Her journal, meticulously kept in the early pages, was recovered years later, wrapped tightly in what appeared to be a child's cotton shirt. The fabric was stained, the binding warped, and when opened, it smelled faintly of iron and earth. The first entry reads, April 3rd, 1953, 2:40 p.m. reached the homestead. Cabin is in poor repair. No doorbell. Knocked twice. No answer. About to leave when 2 children stepped onto the porch. Identical in height, posture, and clothes. No shoes. They did not speak, just watched. It was like standing between 2 reflections. The second entry, just hours later, reveals a deeper unease. April 3rd, 1953, 6:10 p.m. offered canned peaches, which they refused. A woman appeared, older, with white hair and a braid, face sun-darkened. She said only, "You're late." Her voice was flat. She told me they were my echoes. No names. She permitted me to stay the night. Claims to need no help. Will assess further tomorrow. Her entries become shorter after that, her once fluid and formal writing beginning to splinter under the psychological strain. The next day's note is jagged and rushed. April the 4th, unclear time. There's something wrong with their mouths. They move like they're learning to be human. One copies the other before speaking. I asked about their mother. They both pointed at the same tree. No words, just pointed. By the final entry, her hand trembles across the page. April 4th, late. Their lungs don't breathe right. It's not wheezing. It's like timing, like one waits for the other. They hold hands in their sleep. I am the only one who blinks. Evelyn Cross never returned to Louisville. Her disappearance was quietly filed as a presumed accident in wilderness terrain. The official statement from the Department of Family Services blamed poor road conditions and lack of communication infrastructure. But privately, several field officers expressed deep concern. One noted that her assigned driver refused to take any future jobs in Leslie County and left the program entirely. Another recalled a box of Evelyn's field documents being removed from the office by a man claiming to be with the state archives. No such name was later found in any employment records. The journal itself wasn't seen again until 1979, when it surfaced at an estate sale in Harlem. It was purchased by a collector of Southern ephemera, who reported the strange, persistent smell and the way the ink had bled as though the paper had sweated. On the final page, scrawled in different handwriting, possibly not Evelyn's at all, were 3 words: "We breathe together." Officials declined to reopen the case. One internal memo cited a desire not to stir fear among rural constituents. Her name was never added to the National Missing Persons Registry, but in Haydn, they remember, not her name perhaps, but the chilling story of a woman who walked into the hollow and never walked back out. On the morning of April 12, 1954, a light haze was seen curling above the trees at the edge of Hollow Ridge. The sight would have gone completely unnoticed were it not for a single witness. Caleb Langford, a seasoned tobacco farmer whose property bordered the old Meriwether tract. In a statement he gave to a regional folklorist 30 years later, Langford recalled the day with unnerving clarity. "It wasn't like any fire I'd ever known," he explained. "There was no thick, black smoke, just this pale, thin gray rising like steam from a boiling kettle. And the air, it had a strange coppery smell mixed with something like wet earth and mold. Nothing burning should ever smell like that." Langford, a pragmatic man, rode his mule partway up the trail that led to the cabin, but he stopped just short of the boundary. He claimed it wasn't fear that held him back, but a deep-seated instinct. What he saw from the ridge confirmed that something fundamental had changed. The Meriwether cabin, once barely visible through the tangled overgrowth, was gone. Not collapsed, not decayed, but utterly and completely gone. The Leslie County Sheriff's Office received a call about the strange disappearance of the structure 2 days later. A field team, guided by an old mining map and Caleb Langford's directions, arrived by midweek. What they found baffled even the most seasoned investigators. The cabin site had not burned from the outside in, as fires typically do in dry Appalachian timber. Instead, the area was charred in a tight, centralized radius, a fire that had collapsed inward. There were no signs of external accelerant, no scorch marks on the surrounding tree line, and no surrounding blaze to indicate a wildfire. The perimeter of the burn site looked completely undisturbed, as if the fire had ignited deep within the belly of the house, consuming only what it was meant to. Amid the ashes, a few unsettling objects survived. A small child's leather shoe, badly burned with its laces melted. A fragment of a human jawbone, but without any matching dental records in state files. And most haunting of all, 2 sets of small, barefoot prints preserved in the soot like pressed clay, walking away from the ruin, side by side, into the woods, never to return. No adult remains were ever found, no trace of Lila Mae Meriwether. But that was not the end of the story. 3 days after the fire, a single envelope arrived at the Leslie County Sheriff's Office with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed, typewritten paper, folded twice. The note read in a haunting, cryptic message, "The blood went in circles. The twins were never meant to see the sun." The letter had been typed on a Remington Model 5, a machine common in the 1930s and early 40s, but with a distinctive ink blotting pattern, the kind associated with overused ribbons and misaligned hammers. Investigators tried to trace the letter, but postal records led nowhere. No prints were recoverable, and no remnants of the envelope were preserved. The letter was logged, copied, and quietly filed away. No follow-up was ever made. For years afterward, local records omit any mention of the Meriwether fire. A 1955 audit of regional structure fires lists only 2 cases in Leslie County, neither matching the Hollow Ridge location. No insurance claim was ever filed for property. No official death certificate was ever issued. Instead, the land was simply marked abandoned, non-inhabitable. The parcel reverted to the county, but no one ever purchased it, and the trail leading to it faded back into the forest. The absence of follow-up wasn't simple negligence. It was avoidance. Everyone knew not to dig too far, said a retired deputy, Willard Mooney, in a 1983 oral history. That house wasn't a house anymore. It was a wound. For decades, the letter remained in a personnel drawer in the old courthouse, nearly forgotten until it was rediscovered by archivists during a building renovation in 1991. It is now preserved in the county historical annex under a restricted file label, Meriwether Unresolved. To this day, no second letter has ever surfaced. No one has ever confessed. But that phrase, the blood went in circles, has become a local proverb in Haydn, a warning not written in law, but remembered in silence. And though the house is gone, the path remains, overgrown, yes, but not erased. Something ended that April, but not everything. After the fire at the Meriwether cabin in 1954, official documentation of the twins, if any ever existed, ceased entirely. No death certificates, no sightings filed under law of estate. The case had, for all intents and purposes, burned itself into a state of permanent closure. But the people of Appalachia don't need paperwork to remember. They passed down stories, and the stories of the Mirror children began to spread. The first known post-fire sighting occurred in 1956, just 2 years after the cabin disappeared. A hunter named Edgar Mullins, a lifelong resident of nearby Dry Hollow, claimed he was tracking a deer by the dim light of his lantern along a creek bed when he saw something just upstream. 2 boys barefoot were standing ankle-deep in the cold water. At first, I thought they was just lost, Mullins told a regional folklorist in 1971. But then I noticed neither one of them moved. Not even when I stepped in the water, not even when I raised a lantern. They were just staring at the current. Same posture, same head tilt. One on the left had a twitch in his eye like he was trying to remember how blinking worked. The hunter, deeply unsettled, turned back, and by the time he returned with others, the creek was empty. The next major account came from Margaret Hensley, a retired schoolteacher from Pikeville. In 1962, she reported picking up 2 teenage boys on the side of a road near Dismal Creek. They were pale, she wrote in her personal journal, a detail she later shared on a radio program. Not sickly pale, just paper-colored. They were dressed in identical clothing, collared shirts tucked into slacks, their hands folded neatly in their laps, like they'd been taught manners by someone who never met a child. They never blinked, she wrote. Mrs. Hensley offered them peanuts, but they didn't eat. Then one of them turned to her and whispered, "We're going back." They opened the door at a bend in the road and stepped out before she had even stopped the car. Mrs. Hensley filed no report. She told the story only once during a 1974 interview for a traveling radio program called Backward Shadows. That recording was broadcast once, then shelved, and copies now survive only on tape reels held in a private folklore collection in Charleston. By the late 1960s, stories of the Mirror Boys had taken hold across eastern Kentucky and parts of southwestern Virginia. Though no one agreed on names, ages, or exact features, one detail always remained consistent. There were 2, always 2. The folklore spread in layers, weaving itself into the daily lives of the mountain people. Camp counselors warned children not to wander from the firelight after dark. Grandparents muttered about the boys who came to windows at night, staring through the glass but never knocking. In Haydn, stories surfaced of screen doors left ajar in the morning and of muddy footprints outside children's bedrooms, always in pairs, always barefoot. In 1968, the Leslie Ledger, a small-town paper, ran a 1-paragraph note in its Odd Reports column. Mrs. Leanne Carter of Mill Creek reports seeing 2 matching boys watching her cows from the ridge. Says they vanished when called. Husband claimed she was spooked by shadows. No follow-up article was ever published. Academic interest in the legend peaked briefly in the early 1970s when folklorist Dr. Helen Worthing of Berea College published a small paper titled Echoes in the Blood, Appalachian Twin Law and Anomalous Sighting Reports. In it, she cataloged nearly 22 distinct stories, all centered on two silent, identical boys appearing near water, glass, or doorways. These stories, she wrote, are not built from fantasy. They're built from memory. Whether supernatural or not, they carry a weight, familial, regional, inherited. They belong to a place that does not forget. Indeed, the stories continued. A camper in 1973 swore he woke to find two boys sitting cross-legged outside his tent, hands on their knees, their faces slack with sleep or imitation. Others dismissed these tales as mass suggestion born from decades of isolation, poverty, and passed-down dread. But those who had heard the stories long enough knew better. These weren't just campfire tales. They were inheritances unwritten, unburied, a way of remembering what no one was allowed to say, that something survived the fire and it was still watching. In 1971, Dr. Marshall Greaves, a retired clinical psychiatrist from Columbus, Ohio, moved into a modest rental cabin just outside Hyden, Kentucky. Locals assumed he was seeking solitude after decades of hospital work. But his arrival was no accident. Unbeknownst to county officials or neighbors, Dr. Greaves had been privately investigating the 1953 disappearance of Evelyn Cross, a former student of his. Her case, long dormant and quietly buried, had troubled him for nearly 2 decades. He came not for peace, but for answers. Greaves began where the records ended, in the archive rooms of Leslie and Perry counties. He spent months combing through tax rolls, baptismal logs, and handwritten census supplements, searching for evidence of the family Evelyn had been sent to visit. What he found disturbed him. Entire branches of the Merriweather family, particularly from the years 1890 to 1920, seemed to vanish from the public record after 1912. Births were logged, but deaths were not. Marriages disappeared mid-lineage. In one 1908 county registry, he found a list of 6 Merriweather children living at a now-defunct homestead. By 1915, the same names had been crossed out with no corresponding burial or migration notes. As Greaves tracked the family further, a deeply unsettling pattern emerged. Inheritance documents, land transfers, and even literacy records began to show overlapping names. Uncles became fathers. Cousins were listed as siblings, the same surnames repeating in tighter and tighter loops. In a marginal note in his research journal, Greaves wrote, "Not a family tree, but a spiral. The blood turned inward." By 1974, he had compiled over 200 pages of notes, genealogical charts, and transcribed interviews with aging locals. One woman, now blind, told him, "They didn't marry out, never did. They kept to themselves like a promise." Greaves grew convinced that Lila Mae Merriweather had not merely inherited a twisted bloodline. She had deliberately preserved it. In a final typed note left on his desk, he wrote, "This wasn't caregiving. It was architecture. She built them." Greaves believed the twins Evelyn encountered were not a tragic result of isolation, but the intentional outcome of generational inbreeding crafted over time by a woman who saw genetic purity not as science, but as a religious ritual. He planned to publish. He had enough for a manuscript, enough to name names, enough to demand the state reopen the Cross case. But in February of 1979, everything stopped. A neighbor delivering firewood found the front door to Greaves's cabin wide open. Inside, nothing appeared to have been taken. His notes were stacked neatly on the kitchen table, arranged by chapter, sorted, labeled, and completely untouched. His tape recorder still had fresh batteries. His reading glasses rested on top of his journal, and placed squarely at the center of the table was a single black and white photograph, a photograph never seen before. It showed 2 boys barefoot, standing knee-deep in a creek. Their arms were locked at the elbows, their heads tilted identically toward the lens. Their eyes reflected no light, only a deep, unnatural void. It was unclear who took the photograph or when. Greaves was never seen again. Search teams combed the hills for days. Dogs, much like the hunter's horse years before, refused to cross a creek near the old Merriweather plot. No trace of him was found, not even footprints. His disappearance was ruled inconclusive. His colleagues, once skeptical, grew deeply uneasy. Dr. Leslie Warren, who worked with Greaves at the Columbus State Psychiatric Hospital, later said, Marshall believed in patterns, not ghosts, not curses. He saw intention where others saw accident. If he vanished, it's because someone decided the pattern was full. His notes were boxed and archived, though many pages are now missing. The photograph was preserved under glass and marked Evidence, Unknown Origin. The label has since faded. What remains is a growing consensus among researchers and folklorists alike. Greaves did not go too far. He simply got too close. And whatever Lila Mae Merriweather built in that hollow, it was never meant to be examined. In the fall of 1992, a state-funded road expansion project was underway just north of Hyden, Kentucky. The crews were tasked with cutting a new bypass through one of the last undeveloped ridgelines in the county. The project had moved smoothly until the morning of October 4th. According to site logs, a backhoe struck something unusually soft beneath the eastern tree line. At first assumed to be animal remains, the disturbance revealed a shallow pit, roughly 6 feet in diameter, containing 3 partial skeletons, child-sized, curled as if they had been placed there deliberately. Construction halted immediately. The area was taped off, and the Kentucky State Anthropological Unit was dispatched within 36 hours. The lead anthropologist, Dr. Eileen Cass, gave a statement 3 weeks later. Her findings were not released to the public at the time, but notes from a 1994 forensic conference would later surface in a research archive. The bones were human children, likely aged 7 to 10, but the skulls were deformed not from trauma, but from developmental anomalies. The cranial plates had fused prematurely. The jaws, one in particular, were unnaturally aligned, with teeth overlapping in mirrored patterns. They were too symmetrical to be a coincidence, but too wrong to be twins. The remains bore no identifiers, no jewelry, no clothing, no remnants of cloth. DNA sequencing was limited in 1992, but mitochondrial analysis ruled out any match to known missing children in Kentucky dating back to 1960. Dental records found no comparison. The team found no signs of burial markers, no coffins, and no shroud materials. Just bare bone placed directly into the earth. But it was what they found on the smallest jawbone that drew the most concern and confusion. Etched faintly, almost imperceptibly, beneath the right molars was a shallow carving in the bone surface, a looping shape barely a half-inch wide, forming a twisted horizontal figure 8, the infinity loop. Dr. Cass' notes suggest it was carved post-mortem with a fine-pointed metal object. It was not animal markings, nor was it environmental erosion. No further analysis was conducted. Within 6 weeks, the Kentucky Historical Preservation Office released an official statement that was designed to close the case. Indeterminate historic remains, likely pre-1950s. No current criminal relevance. Case closed. The excavation resumed. A former field technician, speaking anonymously to a regional documentary team in 2001, recalled his experience processing the bones. I'd seen everything, he said. Burned corpses, Civil War graves, even a case of fetal remains in Pike County. But this wasn't right. Those kids weren't just deformed. They were copied, like someone tried to make the same person twice and got it wrong 3 times. When I saw the jawbone, when I saw that symbol, I packed my gear and left. I never worked another dig. The bones were transferred to state storage in Frankfurt, sealed in unmarked boxes labeled with the case ID HY9CH3. As of 2025, they remain unexamined. No memorial was erected, and no burial records were created. The pit was backfilled, compacted, and now lies beneath the paved shoulder of Route 13A. The stretch of road is known among construction workers as the Quiet Cut because no birds are heard in that curve of the ridge. None ever nest there. Among folklore circles, however, the discovery reignited old stories. Tales of the Mirror Boys, of strange children seen in pairs staring from creek beds or tree leans. The infinity loop, first mentioned in a Merriweather hymn transcription in 1917, became a topic of heated debate. Was a family symbol a curse, a generational mark passed through blood? In a 1997 article in Appalachian Record, folklorist Dr. Helen Worthing concluded, "We cannot explain what the state has chosen not to question. But in Haydn, the ground speaks when the living won't. These children were not found. They were revealed. The mystery remains. No one has claimed them. No one knows where they came from. But the bones, muted, buried, and marked, have become a kind of silent testimony, not to what happened, but to how far the earth will go to hide what others refuse to see." By the 2000s, most had forgotten the name Merriweather. The cabin was long gone, the bones boxed and buried in government storage, and the stories had softened into mere folklore. But stories don't truly die in Appalachia. They just wait for new witnesses. In August of 2007, a pair of hikers from Hazard County took a shortcut through Hollow Ridge while mapping water levels near the Old Creek bed. One of them, a volunteer scout leader named Jeremy Fields, would later describe the moment in a local interview. "We came around a bend and saw something sticking up in the mud," he recalled. "At first, I thought it was an old trail marker, but it was a wooden cross, just rough pine lashed together with rusted fence wire. And tied to it were two children's shoes side by side, clean as the day they were bought. The shoes, 1950s-era canvas soled, were immaculately preserved, scorched into the cross with a heated nail or wire with the words, 'Same blood, same soul, same end.' There was no nearby trail, no campsite, and no grave. No one ever came forward to claim the memorial." 6 years later, in 2013, a retired bail bondsman turned freelance investigator named Royce Kellerman took on a personal project to trace a series of anonymous letters sent to post offices across 5 towns surrounding Haydn. The letters were small, typed on aging paper, all signed under one name, M. Merriweather. There were no return addresses. Each letter contained vague references to unfinished guardianship, misaligned offspring, and the quiet science resemblance. The contents were unsettling but non-specific enough to avoid legal action, but consistent enough to suggest a pattern. Kellerman cross-referenced mailing times and locations, mapping them to a 42-mile radius. The letters were always dropped in rural mailboxes, always near ridge access roads. His conclusion was chilling. These weren't ghost stories. A living person was maintaining the identity like a ritual, not hiding but circling. He submitted his findings to a local sheriff's office. The report was filed, but no follow-up was made. Then, in 2019, the pattern broke containment. As part of a wildfire prevention program, the U.S. Forest Service deployed aerial drones over remote Appalachian woodlands. One drone surveying elevation patterns over the edge of Leslie County captured 15 seconds of footage flagged as unusual by internal software. The clip showed 2 barefoot figures, pale and thin, moving through dense brush. Their limbs swung in unnatural unison, their heads tilted at the exact same angle. Even in the pixelated grayscale, the synchronicity was profoundly disturbing. They didn't walk as 2 people. They moved as one. The footage was immediately archived under a false positive wildlife anomaly classification and was never released to the public. But someone, a forest technician whose name has been withheld, leaked it. They posted a frame-by-frame breakdown on an encrypted message board used by independent researchers and folklore archivists. The post was deleted within hours, but not before one final quote appeared beneath the video, typed in white against a black screen. "It's not that they survived. It's that someone wanted them to." The technician has not been seen or heard from since. Today, Hollow Ridge is overgrown again. The road leading in is unmarked, and satellite views show only a dense tree canopy. Locals say that GPS doesn't work near the creek, phones glitch, and dogs go quiet. Still, some say they've seen figures in the dusk, always in pairs, pale and barefoot, watching from tree lean. Researchers call it inherited folklore, a psychological echo, a rural myth born from isolation and grief. But that doesn't explain the drone footage, the anonymous letters, or the bones that bore no matching names. The truth is both simpler and darker. The story of the Merriweathers never ended. It just stopped being spoken aloud. And in its silence, it changed names, becoming a movement, a pattern, a living legacy fed from within. Same blood, same soul, same end. They are not gone. They're just waiting,